"Disconnect him," ordered the millionaire's wife, who was in a coma. But when she approached the hospital bed, she was horrified. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains, bathing the luxurious room in a warm golden glow. Sarah Thompson woke up slowly, her hand instinctively caressing her swollen belly. A smile played on her lips as she felt a soft movement under her palm. After years of failed attempts and tears shed, she was finally pregnant. "Good morning, my love," she whispered to her husband, Alexander Foster, who was sleeping deeply beside her. The businessman, known for his sharp mind and multi-million-dollar empire, didn't move. Sarah smiled, knowing how tired he was after working late into the night on a new project. She got up carefully, slipping into a silk robe before walking to the balcony overlooking the lush gardens of their mansion. The scent of freshly bloomed roses filled the air. Mingling with the cool morning breeze, Sarah closed her eyes, inhaling deeply and enjoying the peace of the moment. "How are my two loves this morning?" Alexander's deep voice surprised her. She turned to see him standing in the balcony doorway, his dark hair tousled and a sleepy smile on his face. "Perfect," Sarah replied, allowing her husband to wrap her in an embrace. "The baby has been very active this morning." Alexander placed his hand on Sarah's belly, his eyes shining with excitement when he felt a small kick against his palm. "I can't believe in just a few weeks we'll be parents," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. They had been through so much to get to this point. Years of fertility treatments, shattered hopes, and endless nights of comforting each other. But now, finally their dream was about to come true. "I love you, Sarah," Alexander murmured, softly kissing her forehead. "You and our baby are the most important things in my life." "And I love you," she replied, snuggling closer to him. "Nothing will ever separate us." Little did they know that fate had other plans, plans that would test their love and loyalty in ways they could never have imagined. That afternoon, Alexander was preparing for an important business meeting. His best friend and partner, Michael Sullivan, was waiting for him in the study. "Ready to close the deal of the century?" Michael asked, a confident smile on his face as he handed Alexander a folder full of documents. Alexander nodded, flipping through the papers. "This project will change the game, my friend. Our families will be secure for generations." Michael patted Alexander's shoulder. "And just in time for the arrival of little Foster. How's Sarah?" "Radiant," Alexander replied, his face lighting up at the thought of his wife. "I've never seen her so happy." For a moment, something akin to envy crossed Michael's face, but it disappeared so quickly that Alexander thought he had imagined it. "I'm happy for you," Michael said, his voice warm. "You deserve it after everything you've been through." Alexander looked at his friend with gratitude. Michael had been there for them during the darkest moments, offering support and comfort when things seemed most desperate. "I don't know what we'd do without you, Michael. You're like a brother to me." Michael smiled, but there was a shadow in his eyes that Alexander didn't notice. "That's what friends are for, right? Now let's go make a few more millions." The two men left the study, ready to face the business world. However, while Alexander walked, confidently sure of his future, Michael followed him with a thoughtful look, his thoughts far from the meeting ahead. Sarah was spending the afternoon in the company of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Victoria Foster, an elegant woman with a severe appearance who, despite her cold exterior, had come to love Sarah like a daughter. "You must take better care of yourself, dear," Victoria said, critically observing Sarah as she poured herself another cup of tea. "Remember, you're eating for two now." Sarah smiled patiently. "Don't worry, Victoria, the doctor says everything is going perfectly." Victoria nodded, though her expression remained concerned. "It's just that you've waited so long for this baby, I can't help but worry." "I know," Sarah said softly, taking her mother-in-law's hand, "and I appreciate it. You and Alexander are my family now." For a moment, Victoria's mask of composure cracked, and Sarah saw a flash of guilt. But before she could be sure, the moment had passed. "Speaking of family," Victoria said, abruptly changing the subject, "have you thought about names for the baby?" Sarah smiled, caressing her belly. We have some ideas, but we want to wait until the baby is born to decide, although Alexander insists that if it's a girl, she should carry your name. Victoria seemed surprised for a moment, then smiled sadly. That would be an honor, although I'm not sure I deserve such a distinction. Sarah frowned, confused by her mother-in-law's melancholic tone. Victoria, is everything all right? The older woman quickly composed herself. Of course, dear. Just the memories of an old woman. Now tell me more about the nursery you're planning. As Sarah began to enthusiastically describe her plans for the baby's room, she couldn't help but notice that Victoria seemed distracted, her eyes often looking towards the door as if she expected, or feared, someone to enter at any moment. That night, Alexander returned late from his meeting, fatigue evident on his face, but with a triumphant smile. How did it go? Sarah asked, helping him take off his jacket. Better than we expected, Alexander replied, kissing her softly. The deal is closed. Our future is secure. My love. Sarah hugged him tightly, sharing his joy. I'm so proud of you, Alexander. He looked at her with adoration. All of this is for you and our baby. I want to give you the world. You've already given us everything we need, Sarah said, bringing Alexander's hand to her belly. Your love is more than enough. Alexander smiled, but then his expression turned serious. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Today's meeting, it wasn't just about the new project. Sarah looked at him with concern. What's going on? Alexander led her to the sofa, sitting down next to her. I've decided to make some changes to the company structure. I'm going to name Michael as Deputy CEO. Sarah blinked in surprise. That's a big step, are you sure? Alexander nodded. Completely. Michael has been instrumental in our success, and with the baby on the way, I want to have more time for our family. I trust him to handle the day-to-day operations of the company. Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the information. Although she appreciated Michael, something about this decision unsettled her. Have you talked about this with your mother? You know how protective she is of the family business. Alexander frowned. Not yet. But I'm the one making the decisions now. Besides, I'm sure she'll understand once I explain my reasons. Sarah nodded, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. If you're sure, then I support you completely. Alexander kissed her, tenderly. Thank you, my love. I knew you'd understand. Now, how about we celebrate? Sarah smiled. Putting aside her concerns for the moment, tonight was for celebrating their dreams coming true, not for worrying about what the future might bring. The next morning, Alexander was preparing to leave, early. He had an important meeting with a client out of town and planned to drive himself. Are you sure you don't want the chauffeur to take you? Sarah asked, worried. You've been working so hard lately, and the highway can be dangerous. Alexander smiled, kissing her forehead. I'll be fine. Love, the drive will give me time to think and prepare for the meeting. Besides, you know I enjoy driving. Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gripped her. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Alexander said, hugging her tightly. I'll be back before you know it. As she watched Alexander get into his sports car and drive away down the driveway, Sarah couldn't help but feel that something was going to change. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to alter the course of their lives forever. Little did she know that moment was closer than she thought. Hours later, Sarah was in the garden, enjoying the afternoon sun and making plans for that night's dinner. Alexander had promised to arrive early, and she wanted to surprise him with his favorite dish. Suddenly, the shrill sound of the phone broke the tranquility of the moment. Sarah got up with difficulty, her heart racing for no apparent reason. Something about the phone's ring sounded ominous, as if it were the herald of bad news. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. Hello? The voice on the other end of the line was grave and professional. Am I speaking to Mrs. Sarah Foster? Yes, this is she, Sarah responded, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Foster, I'm calling from Central Hospital. I regret to inform you that your husband, Alexander Foster, has been in a serious car accident. Sarah's world stopped. The doctor's words became a distant buzz as she felt the ground open up beneath her feet. Without realizing it, she dropped the phone, her hands instinctively flying to her belly. "No," she whispered, tears beginning to run down her cheeks. "No, please, no." At that moment, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She looked down, horrified to see a bloodstain spreading across her dress. "Help!" she screamed, her voice broken by panic and pain. "Please, someone help me." As the house staff ran towards her, Sarah collapsed on the ground, her world crumbling around her. In an instant, all her dreams, all her hopes for the future had been shattered. Fate had played its cruel hand, and nothing would ever be the same again. At the hospital, chaos reigned. Doctors and nurses ran back and forth, attending to the injured from the terrible highway accident. In the midst of all this, Michael Sullivan burst into the emergency room, his face pale with concern. "Alexander Foster!" he shouted at the staff. "Where is Alexander Foster?" A nurse approached him, her expression grave. "Are you family?" "I'm his best friend and business partner," Michael replied, his voice trembling. "Please tell me what happened." The nurse guided him to a private room. "Mr. Foster suffered severe injuries in the accident. He's in surgery, right? Now the doctors are doing everything they can, but his condition is critical." Michael collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "Not to Alexander. Not now." At that moment, the emergency room doors burst open, and a medical team rushed in with a gurney. Michael looked up and his heart stopped as he recognized the unconscious woman on the stretcher. "Sarah!" he shouted, jumping to his feet. "What happened to her?" A doctor paused briefly. "Mrs. Foster collapsed at her home. She's pregnant and there are complications. We need to take her to surgery immediately." Michael watched helplessly as they took Sarah away. In a matter of hours, the two most important people in his life were fighting for survival. He sat down again, the weight of the situation crushing him. "Oh God," he whispered, tears beginning to fall. "What have I done?" The hours passed slowly, each minute a torture for Michael. The waiting room gradually filled up. Victoria Foster arrived shortly after, her usual composure broken by fear and worry. Company employees and close family friends also began to arrive, all with the same expression of shock and disbelief on their faces. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a surgeon approached the group. His expression was somber, and Michael felt his heart sink even further. "Family of Alexander and Sarah Foster," the doctor began, his voice tired but professional. Victoria stood up, with Michael at her side. "I'm Alexander's mother," Victoria said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, tell us what's happening." The surgeon took a deep breath. "Mr. Foster suffered very serious injuries in the accident. We've managed to stabilize him, but he's fallen into a coma. At this point, we can't predict when or if he will wake up." A collective gasp ran through the room. Victoria staggered, and Michael held her, although he himself felt like his legs might give way at any moment. "And Sarah?" Michael asked, dreading the answer. The doctor's face darkened even more. "Mrs. Foster suffered a placental abruption due to stress. We did everything we could, but I'm so sorry we couldn't save the baby." Victoria let out a heart-wrenching sob, collapsing in Michael's arms. He hugged her mechanically, his mind still processing the terrible news. "Sarah," Michael managed to say, "how is she?" "She's stable, but very weak," the doctor replied. "The physical and emotional trauma has been severe. We'll keep her under observation for the next few days." Michael nodded, unable to form words. The doctor gave them some more instructions before leaving, letting them process the devastating information. Slowly, Michael helped Victoria sit down. The older woman seemed to have aged years in a matter of minutes, her face marked by pain and disbelief. "This can't be happening," Victoria muttered, more to herself than to others. "My son, my grandchild." Michael knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Victoria, I know it's difficult, but we must be strong. For Alexander and for Sarah. They need us now more than ever." Victoria looked at him, her eyes full of tears. For a moment, Michael saw a flash of something else in her gaze: guilt, fear. But it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "You're right," Victoria finally said, straightening up and regaining some of her usual composure. "We must be strong." Michael nodded, standing up. "I'll go see if I can get more information about Sarah's condition. Will you be all right here?" Victoria made a gesture of assent, and Michael walked away, his steps heavy as he headed towards the intensive care unit. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: pain, guilt, fear, and something else he dared not name. As he walked, he couldn't help but think about the last conversation he had with Alexander, just hours before the accident. His friend's words echoed in his head. "I trust you to handle the day-to-day operations of the company." Michael closed his eyes, guilt threatening to choke him. If only he had known, if only he had said something, but it was too late now. Fate had played its hand, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with the cards he had been dealt. When he reached Sarah's room, he paused at the door, observing the woman lying unconscious in the bed. So fragile, so vulnerable, and yet so beautiful. Michael felt his heart race, and he had to fight against the urge to take her hand. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I promise I'll be here for you no matter what happens. I won't leave you alone." As he made this silent promise, Michael didn't realize that someone else was watching him from the shadows of the hallway. Victoria Foster, who had decided to follow him, saw the expression on Michael's face and felt a chill run down her spine. Fate had set in motion a series of events that would change their lives forever, and Victoria feared that the secrets she had kept for so long would soon come to light. The following days passed in a haze of pain and confusion for Sarah. When she finally regained consciousness, she found herself in a world she no longer recognized, a world without her baby, a world where her beloved Alexander lay in a coma, his future uncertain. Michael was by her side when she opened her eyes, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Sarah," he said softly, "how do you feel?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes empty of emotion. "It's gone," she whispered. "Everything's gone." Michael took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Not everything, Sarah. Alexander is still with us, and I'm here for you." Sarah closed her eyes, tears silently running down her cheeks. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hit something. She wanted everything to be a nightmare she could wake up from, but the pain in her body and in her heart reminded her that this was real, terribly real. "When can I see Alexander?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael hesitated for a moment. "Sarah, there's something you need to know, Alexander. He's in a coma. The doctors don't know when he'll wake up." Sarah felt her world crumble even more. How was it possible to feel so much pain and still be alive? "I want to see him," she said, her voice taking on a tone of determination. "Now." Against the doctor's advice, Michael helped Sarah get to Alexander's room. Seeing him there, connected to so many machines, so still and pale, was like a dagger in Sarah's heart. She approached the bed, taking her husband's inert hand in hers. "Alexander," she whispered, "please, come back to me. I need you. I can't do this without you." Michael watched the scene with a broken heart. Seeing her suffer like this was almost unbearable. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to take her pain and make it his own. But he knew it wasn't the time, nor the place. At that moment, Victoria entered the room. Her gaze fell first on her son, then on Sarah, and finally on Michael. There was a moment of tension, as if each of them held a secret they feared the others would discover. "Sarah, dear," Victoria said, approaching her daughter-in-law, "you should be resting." Sarah shook her head, not letting go of Alexander's hand. "I can't leave him, I can't." Victoria and Michael exchanged a look of concern. They knew the days and weeks ahead would be difficult, full of pain and challenges, but none of them could imagine the trials that fate still had in store for them. As the sun set over the city, bathing the hospital room in a golden glow, The four remained there. Alexander, unconscious and oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. Sarah, consumed by pain and loss. Michael, struggling against his own feelings and guilt. And Victoria, guarding secrets that threatened to destroy everything that was left of her family. The curtain had fallen on the first act of their tragedy, but the true story was just beginning to unfold. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life in the Foster mansion had sunk into a somber routine, marked by daily visits to the hospital and long nights of insomnia and despair. Sarah, a shadow of the vibrant woman she used to be, spent most of her time by Alexander's bedside, whispering words of love and encouragement, hoping against hope that one day he would open his eyes and return to her. Her pain was palpable, a constant presence that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Michael, true to his promise, had become a pillar of support for Sarah. He divided his time between running the company in Alexander's absence and taking care of Sarah, making sure she ate, rested, and didn't completely lose herself in her grief. One afternoon, as Sarah dozed in the chair next to Alexander's bed, Michael watched her from the doorway. His heart ached to see her like this, so fragile and vulnerable. Unable to contain himself, he approached and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch woke Sarah, who blinked in confusion for a moment before recognizing Michael. "Has there been any change?" she asked, hope tinging her voice. Michael shook his head, hating himself for having to disappoint her once again. "I'm sorry, Sarah, no changes." Sarah closed her eyes, a solitary tear rolling down her cheek. Michael, unable to see her pain, wrapped her in an embrace. Sarah clung to him, her body shaking with silent sobs. "I can't go on like this, Michael," she whispered through tears. "I miss him so much. I miss our baby. Why did this happen to us?" Michael hugged her tighter, fighting back his own tears. "I don't know, Sarah, but I'm here for you. I'll always be here." At that moment, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the hallway. Victoria Foster, with narrowed eyes, saw the embrace and the intimacy of the moment. A mixture of emotions crossed her face: concern, suspicion, and something else, guilt. Victoria silently walked away, her thoughts in a whirlwind. She had noticed the growing closeness between Michael and Sarah in recent months, and although she understood that Sarah needed support, she couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Sarah slowly pulled away from Michael, wiping away her tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Michael offered her a sad smile. "You don't have to thank me. You know I'd do anything for you and for Alexander." Sarah nodded, turning her attention back to her unconscious husband. Michael watched her for a moment longer before excusing himself, needing a moment to compose himself. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. What was he doing? How could he feel what he was feeling for his best friend's wife? Guilt was eating away at him, but he couldn't deny the attraction he felt towards Sarah, an attraction that had been there for years, but that he had always kept under control. Until now that night, at the Foster mansion, Victoria paced restlessly in her study. The day's events had disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. Finally, she made a decision. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "It's me," she said when they answered on the other end of the line. "We need to talk. Things are getting complicated here." The voice on the other end of the phone responded calmly. "What's happened?" Victoria looked towards the door, making sure she was alone. "I think Michael is developing feelings for Sarah, and she's vulnerable. I fear she might make a mistake." There was a long silence before the voice responded, "And what do you want me to do about it?" Victoria closed her eyes, knowing that what she was about to say could change everything. "I need you to come. It's time for you to claim what's rightfully yours." "Are you sure?" asked the voice with a tone of surprise. "I thought we had agreed it was better for me to stay away." "Circumstances have changed," Victoria replied, her voice firm. "I need you here, Nathan. Your brother needs you." The word brother hung in the air, loaded with secrets and broken promises. Nathan, the illegitimate son of George Foster, the brother Alexander never knew he had, was finally going to enter the scene. "I'll be there in a few days," Nathan finally said. "I hope you know what you're doing, Mother." Victoria hung up the phone, a shiver running down her spine. She knew she was playing with fire, but she felt she had no other choice. The company, the Foster legacy, had to be protected at all costs, even if that meant unearthing secrets she had kept hidden for decades. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling more rested than she had been in months. For a brief moment, she forgot the nightmare her life had become. Then, reality hit her hard, and the familiar pain settled in her chest. She got up slowly, preparing for another day of vigil by Alexander's bedside. As she dressed, her gaze fell on a photograph on her nightstand. It was from their wedding, she and Alexander smiling radiantly at the camera, their eyes full of love and promises of a bright future. Sarah picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing Alexander's smiling face. "I miss you so much," she whispered. "Please, come back to me." A soft knock on the door pulled her from her. "Thoughts?" "Come in," she said, placing the photograph back in its place. Michael entered, carrying a tray with breakfast. "Good morning," he said with a warm smile. "I thought you might want to eat something before going to the hospital." Sarah returned his smile, grateful for his consideration. "Thank you, Michael. You didn't have to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," he replied, placing the tray on a small table. "You know I care about you." Sarah sat down, taking a cup of coffee. Michael sat across from her, watching her with a mixture of concern and something else that Sarah couldn't decipher. "How are you feeling today?" Michael asked softly. Sarah sighed. "The same as always, waiting for a miracle that seems increasingly distant." Michael extended his hand, taking Sarah's. "Don't lose hope. Sarah, Alexander is strong. He'll wake up." Sarah squeezed his hand, grateful for his support. "Sometimes I wonder what I'd do without you, Michael. You've been my rock through all of this." Michael looked at her intensely, fighting against the urge to tell her how he really felt. Instead, he said, "I'll always be here for you, Sarah. No matter what happens." There was a moment of tension between them, an electric current that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Finally, Sarah withdrew her hand, turning her attention back to breakfast. "We should leave soon," she said, changing the subject. "I don't want to be late to the hospital." Michael nodded, standing up. "I'll wait for you downstairs." As he left the room, Michael couldn't help but look back, his heart heavy with unexpressed emotions and forbidden desires. At the hospital, the daily routine began as always. Sarah took her place by Alexander's bed, holding his hand and talking softly to him about everything and nothing. Michael stayed close, alternating between working on his laptop and observing Sarah with a mixture of admiration and guilt. Mid-morning, Victoria arrived, her face a mask of concern. "How is he today?" she asked, approaching her son's bed. "No changes," Sarah replied, disappointment evident in her voice. Victoria nodded, then turned to Michael. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" "In private." Michael frowned, surprised by the request, but nodded. "Of course, Sarah. Will you be okay alone for a moment?" Sarah made a gesture of assent. Her attention, already back on Alexander, Victoria guided Michael out of the room and towards a small, empty waiting room. Once there, she turned to him, her expression serious. "Michael, what are you doing?" she asked bluntly. Michael looked at her confused. "I don't understand, Victoria." "What do you mean?" Victoria narrowed her eyes. "I've seen you with Sarah. The way you look at her, how you touch her. Do you think I haven't noticed?" Michael paled, his heart racing. "Victoria, it's not what you think. I'm just being a friend, supporting her in these difficult times." "Is that all?" Victoria asked, her voice laden with skepticism. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're taking advantage of Sarah's vulnerability to get closer to her in a way that goes beyond friendship." Michael felt anger mixing with his guilt. "How can you suggest something like that? Alexander is my best friend. I would never do anything to betray him." Victoria stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "For everyone's sake, I hope you're telling the truth. Because things are about to change, Michael. And when they do, I need to know whose side you're really on." before Michael could respond. Victoria turned and left the room, leaving him alone with his turbulent thoughts and growing sense of unease. Meanwhile, in Alexander's room, Sarah continued her silent vigil. Suddenly, she felt a slight movement in the hand she was holding. Her heart stopped for a moment and then began to beat frantically. "Alexander," she whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" For an instant, she thought she saw a slight flicker in Alexander's eyes. She held her breath, waiting, praying. But the moment passed, and Alexander remained still. Sarah let out a choked sob, the hope that had risen in her chest deflating as quickly as it had appeared. "Please," she begged, resting her forehead against Alexander's hand. "Please come back to me." What Sarah didn't know was that in the depths of his unconscious mind, Alexander was struggling. Fragments of memories, distant voices, and confusing sensations swirled in the darkness, and in the midst of all that chaos, one voice stood out, calling him, guiding him towards the light. Sarah's voice, the Foster mansion, once filled with laughter and hope, now seemed like a mausoleum of broken dreams. Silence weighed heavily in the air, interrupted only by the occasional whisper of servants and the echo of solitary footsteps in the long hallways. Sarah found herself in Alexander's study, surrounded by memories of a life that seemed increasingly distant. Her fingers absently caressed the frame of a photograph. She and Alexander, on their honeymoon, their faces radiant with happiness. How had they come to this point? A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Michael entered, his face a mixture of concern and something else that Sarah couldn't decipher. "Sarah," he said softly, "how are you feeling today?" She tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "The same as always, Michael. Living one day at a time." Michael approached, taking a seat across from her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice laden with contained emotion. Maybe it's time to consider other options." Sarah looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "It's been months, Sarah. The doctors say the chances of Alexander waking up decrease every day. Maybe it's time to think about letting him go." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She stood up abruptly, moving away from Michael. "How can you say that?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "How can you suggest that I abandon Alexander?" Michael stood up too, approaching her with his hands extended in an appeasing gesture. "Sarah, please understand, I'm not saying you should abandon him, just that you should consider the possibility of moving on. For your own good." Sarah stared at him, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "My own good? What about Alexander's good? He needs us, Michael. He needs me." "You need to live too, Sarah," Michael said softly, moving closer. "You can't go on like this forever. Alexander wouldn't want to see you suffer this way." For a moment, they were so close that Sarah could feel the heat emanating from Michael's body. There was an instant of tension, a spark of something dangerous and forbidden. But before either of them could do or say anything more, the study door burst open. Victoria Foster entered, her sharp gaze immediately catching the proximity between Sarah and Michael. Her face hardened, but her voice remained calm when she spoke. "Excuse the interruption. Sarah, dear, could I speak with you for a moment?" Alone. Michael quickly stepped back, as if he had been caught doing something improper. "Of course," he muttered. "I'll leave you alone." As Michael left the room, Sarah couldn't help but notice the look of disapproval Victoria shot him. What was going on? Why did she suddenly feel as if she had done something wrong? Victoria closed the door behind Michael and turned to Sarah, her expression serious. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Sarah felt her heart race. What else could go wrong? "What is it, Victoria?" The older woman took a seat, indicating Sarah to do the same. "It's about Alexander and about his father." Sarah sat down slowly, a feeling of dread growing in her chest. "I don't understand." What does Alexander's father have to do with all this? Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was a determination in them that Sarah had never seen before. George, Alexander's father, had another family. Victoria began. A son, to be precise. A son that Alexander never knew about. Sarah gasped. What? But how is that possible? Why didn't Alexander ever know? Because I made sure he didn't know, Victoria replied, her voice laden with guilt and determination. It was my decision to keep Nathan, Alexander's half-brother, out of our lives to protect Alexander, to protect the family business. Sarah stood up, her mind spinning with this new information. Wait, are you saying that Alexander has a brother? A brother he never knew about? Victoria nodded. Yes, and there's more, Sarah. Nathan. He's on his way. He's coming to claim what he believes rightfully belongs to him. Sarah felt the ground move beneath her feet. Why are you telling me this now? Why after all this time? Because things are changing, Sarah, Victoria replied, standing up and approaching her. And I need to know that I can count on you, that you'll be on Alexander's side no matter what happens. Sarah stared at her, a suspicion growing in her mind. What do you mean by on Alexander's side? What's really going on, Victoria? Before Victoria could respond, the study door opened again. This time it was Michael who entered, his face pale and his expression urgent. Sarah, Victoria, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I just received a call from the hospital. It's Alexander. He's shown signs of a brain activity. The doctors think he might be waking up. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Hope and fear. Battling in her chest, Victoria brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. And was that relief or concern? We have to go to the hospital now, Sarah said, moving towards the door. As they hurriedly left the mansion, none of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows of the garden. Nathan, Alexander's long-lost brother, had arrived earlier than expected, and as he watched Sarah, Victoria, and Michael get into the car, a cold smile played on his lips. Let the game begin, he muttered to himself. At the hospital, chaos reigned. Doctors and nurses ran back and forth, monitoring Alexander's vital signs and performing tests. Sarah, Victoria, and Michael waited anxiously outside the room, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Michael's words before receiving the call from the hospital. Had she really considered letting him go? Guilt gnawed at her, mixing with hope and fear for what might happen now. Victoria, for her part, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. The news of Alexander's possible recovery should have filled her with joy, but her face showed a mixture of conflicting emotions. What other secrets was this woman keeping? Michael kept his distance, his face a mask of concern, but inside his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What would happen if Alexander really woke up? What would that mean for his feelings for Sarah, for the future he had begun to imagine? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doctor came out of Alexander's room. The three of them immediately stood up, expectant. Mrs. Foster, the doctor began, addressing Sarah, your husband has shown clear signs of increased brain activity. Although he hasn't fully awakened yet, we believe he's emerging from the coma. Sarah felt her legs weaken. Michael instinctively held her, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Victoria. Can we see him? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded. You can go in, but one at a time. And remember, although he's showing signs of improvement, we still don't know what state he'll be in when he fully wakes up. Prepare yourselves for any eventuality. Sarah was the first to enter. As she approached Alexander's bed, she immediately noticed a change. Although his eyes remained closed, there was more color in his cheeks, and his breathing seemed stronger, more alive. Alexander, she whispered, taking his hand. I'm here, my love. Please, come back to me. To her, amazement and joy, she felt a slight squeeze on her hand. Tears began to run down her cheeks, a mixture of relief and hope flooding her heart. I love you, she said softly. I've been waiting for you. Please open your eyes. As if he had heard her plea, Alexander's eyelids began to flutter. Slowly, very slowly, His eyes opened for a moment. He seemed disoriented, his gaze wandering around the room until it finally settled on Sarah. There was an instant of recognition and then, "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. What happened?" Sarah sobbed with joy, kissing his hand. "You had an accident, my love. You've been in a coma for months, but now you're back with me." Alexander frowned as if trying to remember something. "The accident, the baby. Where's our baby?" Sarah's heart broke a little more. How could she tell him they had lost their child? How could she break his heart just moments after he had come back to her? Before she could respond, the door to the room opened. Victoria entered, followed closely by Michael. Seeing Alexander awake, they both froze in the doorway. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice still weak. "Michael? What's going on?" Victoria approached the bed, tears shining in her eyes. "My boy," she whispered, "you've come back to us." Michael remained silent, his face a mixture of relief and was that guilt? Alexander looked around, confused. "Why is everyone acting so strange? How long have I been unconscious?" Sarah exchanged a look with Victoria and Michael. How could they explain everything that had happened? How could they prepare him for the truths and lies that awaited him? But before anyone could answer, Alexander let out a cry of pain, clutching his head. His body began to convulse violently. "Alexander!" Sarah screamed, terrified. "Help! We need a doctor!" As doctors and nurses flooded the room, pushing Sarah, Victoria and Michael back, none of them noticed the figure observing the scene from the hallway. Nathan, with an indecipherable expression on his face, watched as his half-brother fought for his life once again. "Welcome back, brother," he muttered. "Let the real game begin." The hospital hallway had become a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed in and out of Alexander's room, while Sarah, Victoria and Michael waited, anxiously, their faces pale with worry. Sarah paced back and forth, her hands nervously wringing. "Why is it taking so long? What's happening in there?" Victoria, sitting rigidly in a chair, maintained her outward composure, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "We must be patient, dear. The doctors are doing everything they can." Michael, leaning against the wall, watched Sarah with a mixture of concern and guilt. He wanted to comfort her, but he knew it wasn't his place, especially now that Alexander had woken up. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the lead doctor came out of the room. The three of them immediately approached, anxious for news. "How is he?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The doctor exhaled slowly before responding. "Mr. Foster has suffered a seizure, which is not unusual in patients waking from a prolonged coma. We've managed to stabilize him, but..." "But what?" Victoria pressed, her voice laden with tension. "But it seems the seizure has affected his memory," the doctor continued. "He's experiencing a form of retrograde amnesia. He remembers who he is and recognizes his family members, but he seems to have lost memories from the past few years." Sarah felt the world crumbling beneath her feet. How much exactly has he forgotten? The doctor looked at her sympathetically. "From what we've been able to determine so far, his last clear memories are from about 5 years ago." 5 years. Sarah did a quick mental calculation. 5 years ago, she and Alexander had barely known each other. They weren't married, hadn't gone through fertility treatments, hadn't experienced the joy of pregnancy or the pain of loss. "Can I see him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded. "You can go in, but please don't pressure him. His mind is fragile right now. Give him time to process things at his own pace." Sarah entered the room, followed closely by Victoria and Michael. Alexander was lying in bed, his face pale but awake. When he saw them enter, a weak smile played on his lips. "Mother," he said, extending a hand towards Victoria. Then his gaze fell on Sarah, and there was a flash of recognition, but not the deep love she had hoped to. "See Sarah, right? The new marketing assistant." Sarah's heart sank 5 years ago. That was exactly what she had been to him. A new employee. Nothing more. "Yes, Alexander," she responded softly, struggling to maintain her composure. "I'm Sarah." Alexander nodded, then looked at Michael. Michael, my friend, what happened? Why am I in the hospital? Michael stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. You had an accident, Alexander. You've been in a coma for several months. Alexander frowned, trying to process the information. Months, but how? The last thing I remember is we were working on the Everest project, weren't we? Victoria intervened gently. Son, that was 5 years ago. You've lost some memories due to the accident, but don't worry, we're here to help you recover them. Alexander looked around, confused and a little scared. 5 years. What's happened? In 5 years, what have I missed? Sarah and Michael exchanged a look of concern. How could they explain everything that had happened? The marriage, the attempts to have a child, the pregnancy, the loss. Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the door. Everyone turned to see who it was, and Sarah felt her heart stop. A tall, handsome man, with an undeniable resemblance to Alexander, was standing in the doorway. His eyes, the same shade as Alexander's, scanned the room before settling on the man in the bed. "Excuse the intrusion," he said in a soft but firm voice. "I'm Nathan Foster." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria visibly paled, while Michael seemed completely bewildered. Sarah, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off this man who looked so much like her husband. Alexander looked at Nathan with curiosity. "Foster? Are we related?" Nathan smiled, but there was something cold in that smile. "More than you think, brother, much more than you think." Victoria stepped forward, placing herself between Nathan and Alexander's bed. "Nathan, this is not the time or the place." Nathan looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of resentment and determination. "And when will be the time, Mother? When were you planning to tell Alexander about me? Or did you think you could keep me a secret forever?" The word mother fell like a bomb in the room. Alexander looked at Victoria, then at Nathan, his face a mask of confusion and pain. "Mother," Alexander repeated, his voice trembling. "What is he talking about? Who is this man?" Victoria closed her eyes, as if the weight of her secrets had finally caught up with her. When she opened them again, there were tears in them. "Alexander, I'm so sorry. I should have told you a long time ago." Sarah, feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control, intervened. "I think we should continue this conversation. Another time Alexander needs to rest." But Nathan wasn't willing to back down. "No, Sarah, I think it's time everyone knew the truth, especially Alexander." Michael, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Nathan, please think about what you're doing. Alexander has just woken up from a coma. He's not in any condition to..." "To what, Michael?" Nathan interrupted, his voice laden with bitterness. "To know he has a brother. To know that his perfect family isn't so perfect after all." Alexander, visibly agitated, tried to sit up in bed. "Can someone please explain what's going on? Who are you really?" Nathan approached the bed, ignoring Victoria's attempts to stop him. "I'm your brother, Alexander. Your half-brother. To be exact, son of your father and another woman. The woman he truly loved." The words fell like lightning in the room. Alexander looked at his mother, seeking a denial, an explanation, anything that could disprove what he had just heard. But Victoria's face, full of guilt and pain, told him everything he needed to know. "It's true," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. He's your brother." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. How many more secrets did this family hold? How many more lies and hidden truths were waiting to be revealed? Alexander, pale and shaking, looked at each of the people present in the room. His mother, who had hidden the existence of a brother from him all his life. Sarah, a woman who was apparently more than just an employee, but whose feelings towards him were a mystery in his amnesiac mind. Michael, his best friend, who seemed to be keeping his own secrets. And Nathan, this newly discovered brother, whose intentions were as unclear as his sudden appearance. I want everyone to leave," Alexander finally said, his voice broken by emotion and confusion. "Everyone. I need to be alone." Sarah took a step towards him, but Alexander's gaze stopped her. There was no recognition in those eyes, no love, only confusion and pain. One by one, they left the room. Victoria, with tears running down her cheeks, Michael, with an expression of guilt and concern, Nathan, with a barely disguised smile of satisfaction, and finally Sarah, feeling that each step that took her away from Alexander was a step towards an uncertain and terrifying future. In the hallway, the silence was oppressive. Each was lost in their own thoughts, in their own fears and secrets. Nathan was the first to break the silence. "Well, family," he said, his voice laden with sarcasm, "I think we have a lot to talk about." Victoria looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Nathan, I'm warning you. If you've come to cause trouble—" "Trouble?" Nathan interrupted, laughing humorlessly. "No, Mother, I've come to claim what's rightfully mine, and now that Alexander is indisposed, I think it's the perfect time to do it." Michael stepped forward, his face serious. "What do you mean by that?" Nathan smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "I mean, dear Michael, that it's time for the Fosters to recognize their other son. And with Alexander out of the game, I think I'm the perfect candidate to take the reins of the family business, don't you think?" Sarah, who had remained silent until now, finally found her voice. "You can't do that. Alexander is the rightful heir. He is your husband?" Nathan completed, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "A husband who doesn't even remember you, Sarah A. Husband who, from what I've seen, might be better off without you." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Before she could respond, Michael intervened. "Enough, Nathan. You don't know what you're talking about." Nathan turned to Michael, a knowing smile on his lips. "Don't I? I think I know more than you all think. For example, I know about your feelings for Sarah. Do you think I haven't noticed how you look at her?" Michael paled, while Sarah looked at him in surprise. Victoria, for her part, looked like she was about to faint. "This has gotten out of hand," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "Nathan, please, we can talk about this in private. We don't need to—" "More secrets, Mother," Nathan interrupted. "I think we've had enough secrets in this family, don't you think?" At that moment, the door to Alexander's room opened. A nurse came out, her face worried. "Excuse me," she said, looking at the group. "Mr. Foster is asking for Sarah. He says he needs to talk to her alone." All eyes turned to Sarah. She felt the weight of their gazes, the weight of expectations and secrets that had yet to be revealed. With a deep sigh, Sarah straightened up. This was the moment of truth, the moment to face Alexander, to try to rebuild what they had lost, to fight for their love and their future. "I'm going in," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "And when I come out, we're all going to have a long talk. No more secrets, no more lies." As Sarah headed towards Alexander's room, she felt like she was walking towards an uncertain future. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same after all. This day. The door closed behind her, leaving the rest of the group in the hallway, each lost in their own thoughts and fears about what the future held for them. The silence in the hospital room was deafening. Sarah approached Alexander's bed slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes followed her, a mixture of confusion and curiosity in his gaze. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice still hoarse from disuse, "I need you to tell me the truth, the whole truth." She took a seat next to the bed, her hands trembling slightly. "Where do you want me to start?" Alexander looked at her intently. "From the beginning. What are you and I really?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "We're husband and wife, Alexander. We got married 3 years ago." Alexander's eyes widened in surprise. "Married? But how?" "The last thing I remember is that you were my assistant." "Things changed," Sarah responded softly. "We fell in love. It was beautiful." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember. When he opened them again, there was a mixture of frustration and sadness in them. "I don't remember, I'm sorry, but I can't remember any of that." Sarah felt her heart breaking a little more, but she stayed strong. It's okay. The doctors say your memory might come back with time, and if it doesn't, well, we can create new memories. Alexander nodded slowly, but there was something else in his expression. There's something more, isn't there? Something you're not telling me. Sarah felt tears threatening to fall. Yes, she whispered. We were expecting a baby, but we lost it in the accident. The impact of the news was visible on Alexander's face. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something, but then he closed his eyes, a solitary tear rolling down his cheek. I'm sorry, he finally said. I'm sorry, I can't remember. I'm sorry for your pain. Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Alexander opened his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. And what about that man, Nathan? Is he really my brother? Sarah nodded. Yes, he's your half-brother. Your mother. Well, I think she should be the one to tell you that story. And Michael, Alexander asked. There's something strange about the way he looks at me, the way he looks at you. Sarah felt herself blushing. Michael is complicated. He's been a great support during your absence, but he's in love with you, Alexander completed, his voice surprisingly calm. Sarah looked at him surprised. How do you know? Alexander gave a small smile. I may have lost my memories, but I'm not blind. I saw how he looked at you. Sarah didn't know what to say. How could she explain the complexity of her feelings, the confusion she had experienced during the months he was in a coma? Alexander, But before she could continue, the door to the room burst open. Nathan entered, followed closely by Victoria and Michael. Sorry, brother, Nathan said, his voice laden with sarcasm, but I think it's time we all talked. Victoria stepped forward, her face a mask of determination. Nathan, please, this isn't the time. And when will be the time, Mother? Nathan replied, his voice rising. When were you planning to tell Alexander the whole truth? About me? About Father? Alexander looked at his mother, confusion evident on his face. What is he talking about, Mother? What else have you hidden from me? Victoria seemed to age years in a matter of seconds. With a deep sigh, she began to speak. Your father, he wasn't the man you thought he was, Alexander. He had another family. Nathan is the result of that relationship. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander looked at Nathan, then at his mother, and finally at Sarah and Michael. Did everyone know? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah shook her head. I found out recently when you woke up, Michael. I suspected, Michael interrupted, stepping forward. But I wasn't sure until Nathan showed up. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Oh, come on, don't act like you're all innocent in this. Mother has been manipulating things for years. And you, Michael, do you really think no one has noticed how you look at your best friend's wife? Michael paled, while Sarah felt her heart racing. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be struggling to process all. The information enough, Alexander finally said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. I want the truth, the whole truth now. And so, one by one, the secrets began to come to light. Victoria revealed how she had discovered her husband's infidelity and how she had worked for years to keep Nathan out of their lives, fearing he might threaten Alexander's inheritance. Nathan told his story of growing up knowing he had a brother he was never allowed to meet, of how resentment and bitterness had consumed him over the years. Michael, with tears in his eyes, confessed his feelings for Sarah, how he had fought against them for years, and how Alexander's absence had brought those feelings to the surface. And Sarah, with her heart in her hand, spoke of her love for Alexander, of how she had struggled during the months he was in a coma, of the confusion and pain she had experienced. When everyone had finished speaking, silence fell over the room again. Alexander closed his eyes, as if trying to process everything he had heard. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at each of the people present. We've made many mistakes, he said softly. All of us, we've lied, we've hidden things, we've hurt those we love. He turned to Nathan. You're my brother. It doesn't matter how you came into our lives, you're my family, and if you're willing, I'd like to get to know you, really. Nathan, surprised by the peace offering, nodded slowly. I'd like that, he said, his voice devoid of its usual sarcasm. Alexander then looked at his mother. Mother, I understand why you did what you did, but the secrets and lies have hurt us all. We need to be honest from now on. Victoria, with tears in her eyes, nodded. I'm so sorry, son. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Alexander turned to Michael. My friend, I can't blame you for your feelings. The heart wants what it wants, but I need to know if I can trust you. Michael, with guilt evident on his face, stepped forward. Alexander, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to. I would never act. You're my best friend. That hasn't changed. Finally, Alexander looked at Sarah. His eyes softened as they met hers. Sarah, I don't remember our love. I don't remember our life together, but I see in your eyes everything we've shared. And if you're willing, I'd like to try to remember, or if I can't remember, I'd like to create new memories with you. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. Oh, Alexander, she whispered. Of course I love you. I've always loved you. At that moment, something seemed to change in Alexander's eyes, a flash of recognition, a glimpse of memory. Wait, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I remember something. It's blurry, but we were in a garden. There were red roses everywhere, and you were wearing a white dress. Sarah held her breath. Our wedding, she whispered. You're remembering our wedding? Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his whole face. Yes, he said softly. I'm remembering. Suddenly, the room was filled with a different energy. It was no longer a place of secrets and lies, but a place of hope and new beginnings. Nathan stepped forward, extending his hand to Alexander. Brother, he said, his voice laden with emotion, if you'll allow me, I'd like to be part of your life, of all your lives. Alexander took his hand, squeezing it firmly. I'd like that, Nathan. Victoria approached, embracing her two sons for the first time. My boys, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I promise that from now on there will only be truth between us. Michael, feeling out of place, began to back towards the door, but Alexander called out to him. Michael, he said, you're my best friend. You always have been. I know things are complicated now, but I need you in my life, in our lives. Michael nodded, tears shining in his eyes. Thank you, Alexander. I promise I'll never betray your trust again. Sarah, feeling like her heart might burst with joy, approached Alexander's bed. He extended his hand to her, and when their fingers intertwined, they both felt that familiar spark, that connection that not even amnesia had been able to erase. I love you, Alexander whispered. I don't remember everything, but I remember that I love you, Sarah. Sarah leaned in, gently kissing his lips. And I love you, Alexander. Always, as the sun set outside the hospital window, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow, the Foster family, now larger and more united than ever, realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with honesty, forgiveness, and above all, love. And although they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome, they also knew that together, as a family, they could face anything fate threw their way, because in the end, true love always finds a way. And for Alexander and Sarah, for the entire Foster family, this was just the beginning of their happily ever after.